Hey guys, it's Julie Spencer again, authorjuliespencer.com. If you want to connect with me on social media. In the first video I told you about myself a little bit, and in the second video I told you about the first books that I ever wrote and published. And I want to fast forward a little bit from the time that I published The Cove, which was my first fiction book. I wrote the book called The Farmer's Daughter, which is great. It's not published yet. It is ready to be published. I've even uploaded the cover, and something is making me hesitate about it. It's all formatted and edited and everything, and I think that I may need to submit it to a publishing company. Anyway, that scares me because I really love to self-publish, independently publish, and keep control over my books, but this one I'm really hesitating with. It's a very cool story, Christian women's fiction. Not romance. I mean, it's very romantic, but it doesn't follow the exact romance format. So fits in the more of the Christian women's fiction. But after I wrote that book and set it aside, I had inspiration for what has now become my Buxton Peak series. So it was originally inspired by the pop band One Direction. I love One Direction. I have every one of their CDs, and in fact, I actually have one of their CDs in my CD player in my car right now. So I listen to them a lot. I envisioned my character to look a lot like Niall Horan from One Direction. Not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. But my band actually is a rock band, not a pop band. But when I first started writing Buxton Peak, I thought that this was one book. And as I was working with my critique partners, we realized that it is not one book, it is 3 books. And so I created 3 books instead of one. So they are Buxton Peak Book 1, who is Ian Taylor, my main character, Ian Taylor. Buxton Peak Book 2, Center Stage. And Buxton Peak Book 3, The End of the Beginning. Now, a couple things happened while I was writing this. I decided to write a prequel. I decided that the guys in the rock band Buxton Peak needed a story prior to book 1 of Buxton Peak, who is Ian Taylor. He grew up. So this was back when it starts when he was 8 years old, like half of a chapter when he was 8 years old, and then it moves into when they are early teenagers and how he met his band members, and it goes all the way fast forward to right before he meets Megan, who is a love interest in his first book, and she ends up, spoiler alert, they get married. Anyway, so throughout the rest of the series, we see Megan. We don't see Megan in this book. And I promised in a previous video that I was going to tell you which book was my favorite book I've ever written, and this is it. Buxton Peak, The Early Years, is my favorite book that I've ever written. Now, I don't recommend reading this paperback version of it. I recommend that you listen to the audiobook version, because the audiobook version was just published a few months ago, and it actually contains a whole bunch of bonus material, and it is so cool. So I would strongly recommend going straight to the audiobook version for that one. But if you want to read the paperback, that's okay too. So fast forward a little bit, and the whole billionaire book craze popped up. And my son said, "Mom, you should write a billionaire book." And I said, "Well, I don't write billionaire books." And he said, "You should." So I actually rewrote, not just edited, but rewrote Buxton Peak Book 1, who is Ian Taylor, and I turned it into Billionaire Rockstar Romance. So I changed the story format, the story structure, so that it's more of a romance novel rather than a love story, because Buxton Peak, who is Ian Taylor, is more of a love story. This one is more of an actual straight romance. So this is the first book that I ever wrote that was a romance in the traditional story structure. I also took everything religious out of it, unfortunately, which the whole rest of the series kind of could fall into the Christian category on Amazon too, but on a bookshelf in a library or in a bookstore, it would fall into the Christian category. This one, the Billionaire Romance, is not Christian. I've taken everything out of it. Everything I can think of anyway. I've been told that it's not as mainstream as I think it is, but it's got everything that I think of as religious as out of it. So I don't even recommend reading the first book, book 1. I'm not even going to print any more of these. They're out there, so if you have one, it's awesome. But if you're just starting into the Buxton Peak series, I strongly recommend reading Billionaire Rockstar Romance. It's technically book 1, although if you really want to get technical, I just said technical twice, Buxton Peak The Early Years is kind of where you would start. But if you've never been introduced to the Buxton Peak series, that's a great place to start also. While I was writing The Early Years, I realized that book 3 needed to be rewritten. And so prior to this being published, I actually rewrote book 3 based on some things that happened in the early years. So I didn't just edit it, I rewrote it, which is totally cool that I knew the story well enough to be able to do that. So then Andy needed his own story. And he needed to meet Vanessa. And this is Vanessa. Isn't she beautiful? She's got a little tulip. And actually, tulips are kind of significant in the story. But she lived in Nashville. And during the time of book 2 of Center Stage, Buxton Peak book 2 Center Stage, there's a whole time period where Ian and Kai, the lead guitar and the lead singer, songwriter, Ian, Kai is the lead guitar, they were in Michigan. Told you all my stories take place in Michigan. And Andy and Gary are in London. So you don't see anything of Andy and Gary. In fact, the reader doesn't really know what's going on in Andy and Gary's lives while book 2 is happening. But London Bridges, Buxton Peak London Bridges, is actually a bridge story between book 2 and book 3. So it is basically takes place at the same time period as book 2, but in London. And then they change the course of the whole band when Vanessa drags Andy to Nashville. And while there, they meet Nathaniel, who is one of the main characters in Buxton Peak Book 3, The End of the Beginning. And I won't tell you about that because you just have to read it. If I spoil that part of it, I'm spoiling a lot about the series. So just know that Nathaniel is an awesome character. He is introduced in book 3, but the reason that he's introduced in book 3 is because Vanessa brings Andy to Nashville. So then if you take all of these books together and make them into one, then you have Buxton Peak, the Complete Collection. And Buxton Peak, the Complete Collection has kind of like everything I've ever wanted to have in Buxton Peak all in one book, including background information, journal entries from Ian Taylor, tweets, his little travel log. It has tons of more information about the rock band. Like I said, I kind of crammed everything I've ever wanted into Buxton Peak, the Complete Collection. Now, oddly, there's actually one more book in the series, and I don't even have a physical paperback copy of it yet. That's how new it is. And it was written in collaboration with Australian author Laura Winter, and she and I actually took her rock band, Infusion Deep, in her rock band series, the band, and my rock band, Buxton Peak, and we took it during the time period of the early years when Buxton Peak was just starting out, and it is called Opening Act Buxton Peak Meets Infusion Deep. So Buxton Peak is the opening act for Infusion Deep for a whole summer, and it's just really cool. So these are companion stories. Like I said, I don't even have a paperback copy of them yet. The paperbacks were just made recently. So there are 2 books. One of them is from Laura Winter's main character's perspective, and the other is from Ian's perspective. So we've got Opening Act Infusion Deep meets Buxton Peak, and Opening Act Buxton Peak meets Infusion Deep. Very cool. All the dialogue meshes together, so you're not really missing anything, except that there's a whole bunch of background material on her band in her side of the book, and a whole bunch of material on mine, from me and Taylor's perspective and from our guys in Buxton Peak. So I strongly recommend reading both of them. They are both available on Kindle, and hers is actually free on all platforms. Mine we're working on it. It's free on several platforms, but not yet on Kindle, but it is available on Kindle. The cool thing about the audiobook version of Buxton Peak, the earlier years, the audiobook version contains Buxton Peak meets Infusion Deep. So opening act Buxton Peak meets Infusion Deep is on the audiobook version of Buxton Peak the Early Years. So if you listen to the audiobook of Buxton Peak the Early Years, you're going to get a ton more background material that was in this book, a couple of new chapters that weren't even written yet, and then the entire opening act is kind of crammed in there in the middle, and it's so cool. So I strongly recommend that, the audiobook version of Buxton Peak the Early Years. So I have a lot of other books that are not related to Buxton Peak, and I will start those in the next video, and we'll see you then. Thanks.